Good afternoon, friends and viewers. I am Reverend Chantel Hinton Hill, and I am an equity officer with the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation. We are the organization who is sponsoring this conversation series, The Greatest of These, and I am excited today that we have a wonderful cadre of panelists who will be talking about the role of faith in social movements. A little bit about the why we're here. This group we've brought together is the kicking off point, the tipping off point of a new faith-based strategy that we really hope will bring new life and revitalize the conversation around justice in Arkansas. We know that leaders of faith have such an integral role in really pushing for the change that we need to see, not just in our world, but in our communities. And so the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation is partnering with folks such as the Faith Matters Network, the Methodist Foundation of Arkansas, and Auburn Theological Seminary to bring to you a fellowship program for faith leaders called the Micah Fellows Program, which you will hear about more in the coming days. We are excited for this fellowship program, and we're partnering with the Right Reverend Ryan Davis, who is helping us to coordinate this program and these conversations on today. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my friend Ryan, and I wish you well.
Thank you to Reverend Chantel Hinton Hill. Thank you to the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation. Thank you more so to our esteemed panelists for today. We're glad you're here. It's good for siblings to be together in unity, if I can preface that piece of scripture. And if you don't mind, if you'll indulge me a second, I'd like to formally introduce all of you. I want to introduce first Reverend Lupita Chavarria, the Associate Pastor of the United Methodist Church's Southwest Cooperative Parish at both St. Andrew's United Methodist Church and Guyer Springs United Methodist Church. Reverend Chavarria is also the founder and executive director of AMA, Association of Women of Arkansas, whose programs and mission are local, statewide, national, international, and all dedicated to the needs of women and their families. I'd like to welcome back virtually to his hometown, Little Rock, Arkansas native Reverend Dr. Sterling Freeman. Reverend Dr. Freeman is a leadership coach. I've had the privilege of being coached, an organizational and cultural change agent, facilitator, counselor, and public speaker. Having been in this Christian ministry since 1996, Reverend Sterling brings a pastoral orientation to this work and is inclined toward, I like this when I found it, is inclined toward deep listening, holding empathy, and meeting people where they are, something that I need more doses of. Thank you, Reverend Freeman, for being with us. Introducing the God willing and Bishop consenting, the Reverend Sarah Smith, a preacher and servant in the Episcopal Diocese of Oklahoma. During Reverend Smith's time at Vanderbilt, she received the ARCIS grant to work on LGBTQ+ issues and faith, through which she co-founded the ongoing ministry Launchpad. We're very grateful to have you with us, soon to be Reverend Sarah Smith. And last but certainly not least, Reverend Cory Anderson. Reverend Anderson is the Chief Innovation Officer at the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation. He also serves as the Interim Executive Director of Forward Arkansas. Reverend Anderson understands collaboration because it's been his career for 7 years at the Annie Casey Foundation and in his help leading the Kids Count initiative there. Reverend Anderson is currently a BME Public Voices Fellow, and we're glad to have him among the people at the table today. And so, you all, I think, maybe have had a little bit of time to think about this, and gladly you bring forward to this conversation some experiences that, won't make us have to labor too hard to think about where we're headed in this conversation. We're talking today about the role of faith. I would extend it to say the role of faithful people, the role of faith communities in social change movements, specifically in the South. We have but to look at folks like Fannie Lou Hamer, who, though semi-literate, knew and held in high esteem in her heart the words to This Little Light of Mine, a song that in its physical intonation, carried some folks over from jail back on the streets to march again. So we don't have any, we don't have a poverty of examples, certainly. I think about one of my favorite songs by one of my favorite artists, Mahalia Jackson, who says, "I look back and wonder at how I got over." And so we're here to talk about that today. And want to begin with some of our leading questions. You know, Reverend Anderson and all of us together, we can answer this. Faith and faith communities have been the fuel that have fed the very passionate flame in the fight for freedom. American history is replete with examples of faithful people who have, in a defiant manner, broken those sacred vessels of tradition and values in order to serve up radical change, even incremental radical change. What are some models that you think of or that inform your ministry? And I would extend this to everybody. What are some folks, some models that you think of that inspire you for today's context?
Sure, and thank you, Reverend Davis. You know, one, you actually just sort of started down the line when you started talking about Mahalia Jackson. You know, and part of the question is, so how far back do you want to go, right? Like we can talk about Moses, we can talk about Jesus, and then come into the common era. A lot of our, particularly Black denominations, right? Like those were started by folks that were doing what you said. They were breaking the vessels of these systems that didn't work for them. So you've got people like Charles Mason, our own Arkansas born and raised, that started the Kojic Church, and folks like Richard Allen and Absalom Jones that pulled people out of the Methodist Church that wasn't serving them well, and built an institution that continues to serve us today. You mentioned Miss Mahalia, but Nanny Helen Burroughs, again, a faith leader that set up this radical wing of women in the Baptist Church, right, of all places, and work for suffrage for women. And then if I come forward into modern times, one, we got all the folks on the call here, right? That everybody here in their own context is working to do what you said. But nationally, people like Mike McBride in West Berkeley that created the Live Free campaign. And I met Pastor McBride a couple times, but I going back to the Kojic Church, like I knew that what Mike McBride was doing with Live Free organizing churches was powerful when I saw him at West Angeles Church of God in Christ in Los Angeles with the bishop of the Kojic Church professing these progressive ideas about the prison industrial complex. And I'm a Kojic kid, right? I grew up Kojic. So to see the bishop of the Kojic Church, which is by one of the most conservative that we've got, but to see him talking about these issues in a way that was aggressive and policy focused and systemic focused, that's when I knew Pastor McBride was on to something. Of course, folks like Reverend Barber started Moral Mondays, and again, helping faith leaders really focus on public policy as this lever for change, which is something, again, that we had not seen in mass. I'd be remiss and I'd be inauthentic to myself if I didn't, mention Malcolm and Betty and Martin and Coretta. Again, as part of the civil rights movement, setting a model that others could follow. I could continue, but I'll stop there, because the thing that those folks have in common, though, is they were systems focused, right? They were motivating, educating, informing, and organizing people using faith as the crux, and they were focused on systems, right? They were focused on changing the systems whose outcomes weren't equitable. And honestly, that's why we put this fellowship together. That's why Reverend Hill's been working so hard on it, is because we need to take those models and continue to think about how we change these systems so that the outcomes that we get are just much more equitable.
Thank you. Reverend Smith, what in your your estimation of this question, what is informed, from the context of history, your own personal history, history in general has informed your, for lack of a better description, posture toward issues of justice and progress in your ministry?
Two people really stand out for me and who I've adored for a long time. Dorothy Day in the Catholic worker movement, and just the way she, kind of gave up her life in this kind of what we call a kenotic self-love, the self-emptying love of Christ, right? To help folks on the margins, especially poor people, folks with disabilities, folks who had nothing to eat, and create kind of work within her system of privilege of the Catholic Church to use Reverend Cory's word of galvanizing, her constituents and her people and the resources of the Catholic Church to create, a nationwide, worldwide movement of the Catholic Charity Foundation that is in every major city in the U.S. at least. And then even more contemporary to her, the Reverend Becca Stevens in my tradition in the Episcopal Church, who started the Magdalene House movement and the Thistle Farms social enterprise to help get women off the streets. And there are Magdalene houses throughout the country. And she has done so much to lift women out of sex trafficking, addiction, domestic violence, really pulling folks from the margins. Again, using her affluence as a white woman, especially in Nashville, Tennessee. Her husband's a famous country music writer, and using her community of power and influence to help create real change and have that kind of grow and grow and grow. And not just the Episcopal communities in the US, but all over the world. And using things like, women in Ghana making tea and helping them rise out of poverty in Ghana and use their resources and a way to monetize the things that they're already doing and selling them in the US. And she's just helping lift women up literally worldwide, using just her skill set and associations with business and the church. And it's just a really incredible way of using resources and power to lift folks up. So those are folks that I really look to.
I have to remind myself, Sarah, to find some examples of folks that I can touch, because sometimes folks who are gone on can become so lofty that the things they aspire to are unattainable. So I appreciate that example. Reverend Chavarria, in your ministry, what in history, what in your personal life can you point to that really galvanizes you, that makes you continue despite Arkansas sometimes, despite our region, despite our legislators, despite the people in charge, and I think about Reverend Smith. You said Dorothy Day, and what I remember of her is saying that that folks can't see that we must lay one brick at a time, take one step at a time, and I guess it involves some sort of patience. What gives you patience, Reverend Chavarria?
Well, for me, all the situation to live here in Arkansas, I moved here because I've been married with one white man. And during this time, a very short marriage, I discovered a group of people who were trapped in slavery in the south of Arkansas. I was living in the Queen in that time. So I went to that town and rescued these 18 men they were Mexican, and they been invited to work here, but they never paid them in 8 months. And there was not communication with the family. So no pay, no communication for 8 months. And that gave me a very different view. So about all the situations of the people. So I've been trying to learn more how the people live here, and I'm here. That's why. And one of the, after years, because I've been here for 20 years and 16 here in Little Rock, and after all these years, one of the principal or most important thing that I see that trap the people in poverty or in very difficult situations of life without any hope to get out is the lack of education, the lack of the education of the system, especially the lack of education in how the system operates. The parents don't know what to do with the school of the kids. The parents don't understand their own rights, and they live in a very awful houses, very expensive, in all the situations that it is kind of difficult. And this affect especially all the Latino community here in the state, but not just the Latino community. Every family who is poor or they make just a little money, the way of the expenses of that money or the distribution of that money, to me, that my background is marketing and business administration and international business. That means a real sick economy of the state, whatever the politicians like to hear or not. But one state with no public transportation is not good for the poor people. It's not good for the people who live in poverty, but they need to expend a big amount of money or a big percent of the income. That is a real sick economy, real sick. In whatever other country, even if it's so poor country, the people expend less than 10% in transportation. And here, for the very poor people, they spend 40%. So that is one statistic that no one wants to see, but I have contact with the people. So I ask the people how much you spend, how much you do all these things. And it is people who are trapped in poverty forever. So when we see they need help with food pantry ministries and things like that, that save the day, but not the week, not the year, not the entire generation. That don't change. That just feed the people for 1 week or 2 days.
You've really laid something bare for me at least, Reverend Chavarria, because one of my mentors talks a lot about the ministry of presence. You said two things. You said several things, but two of which struck me in that note about, you said I'm here, and you said I'm present with the people, and you really laid bare with some of those things. And so, certainly, we're not just informed by, to state the obvious, by history, but by our current reality. How do we confront that as people of faith? Reverend Freeman, one of your alma maters, Virginia Union. When I think of Virginia Union, I think of folks like Samuel DeWitt Proctor. I think of folks like Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright, just to name two exemplars of what it means to, when I look at Abyssinia under Reverend Dr. Proctor's tenure, when I look at Trinity under the tenure of Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright, they are exemplars of what it means for faith in action. And so I wonder how, just that space, in the cosmic sense or in the regular sense, how it propelled you to do the kind of work that you do. What has informed you to be faithful to this work?
Reverend Davis, thank you so much. Thanks to Reverend Hill as well, and all of the my colleagues here. It's a joy to be here with you and listening to you and learning from you just in these few moments. Reverend Davis, it's a good question. And certainly, I think it is easy for me to name folks with whom I identify in a multiplicity of ways, like the Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright as a Black preacher pastor. And folks who are associated certainly with Virginia Union, Reverend Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor, who has been a mentor through his books and his writings, and Reverend Dr. John Kinney, who is just a wonderful, wonderful practitioner as it relates, not only a scholar, but a practitioner as it relates to doing a public theology of justice. And so I think there are many, and we can go back in history and talk about Vernon Johns, right? Before we get to Dr. King at Dexter Avenue, who would preach till the power came down, and then Reverend Anderson put on his coveralls and sell produce off the back of his truck, right, to feed community. So yeah, I identify with those who I think my Dalit brothers and sisters in India would call the organic leaders, the leaders from the base communities, right? But I think one of the things that has informed and inspired me, Reverend Davis, is someone you mentioned, and those of her ilk, not Reverend, but Fannie Lou Hamer, whose life, who had about a 10-year span where she was what I would call preaching all over the country, right? She was an in-demand preacher. I'd like to call her a preacher because she was definitely carrying the good news. And it's people like Fannie Lou Hamer and Polly Murray and those folks who, in some ways, certainly racially, I can identify, but there are ways in which they challenge me in all of the ways I sort of carry privilege in the world. And so they sort of keep me sort of looking and searching through that sort of multifocal lens of the ways in which identities come together to shape a justice lens, right, for me. And so I think it's those folks who really I find inspiration in a Fannie Lou Hamer, a Polly Murray, a Nannie Helen Burroughs, Reverend Anderson, a Jarena Lee, right, who not only were sort of standing against that sort of machine, of white supremacy and white dominance, but then having to stand interculturally, right, and intraculturally, at these intersections and find space to lift and amplify their voices. So I think the inspiration and the challenge for me, I've always tried to sort of keep that at the fore, because I know there are ways within my own context that I could become too comfortable. That if I'm not careful, I could mess around and be a part-time justice person, right? Gloria Hall said, all of the women are white and all the blacks are men, but some of us are brave, right? And so for me, it has been about looking at all of those ways, Reverend Davis, that I actually hold privilege in this journey, right? Even as a black person, but hold privilege to turn that back to myself so I can stay sober, so I can stay humble, so I can ask, even as I'm fighting the good fight, what am I missing? How am I complicit, right, in these things? So it's sort of really trying to continue to make sure that I focus on those places that are not like me, right, that pour into me, inspire me in this work.
Let me jump on with Reverend Freeman, and he and I do this. This is quite a bit. We can't not talk, but comparatively to the historical folks we named, right? I think you named it, Reverend Freeman. Like all of us hold level of privilege comparative to the historical folks that were doing the work in a context that we probably would have just wilted and fell away and died if we had to work in that context. But I just, as I looked at my notes, just to make this relevant and real, particularly here in the space in Arkansas, I mean, there are other folks that I thought about who like you, Reverend Freeman, who have a position of privilege and also a level of courage, right? That pushes against that privilege and puts themselves out there. And again, I would start with Reverend Davis, our own Reverend Davis here. Now, this is a man that that has a good job, right? Good state job, right? He can but that does not stop him, right, from giving this clarion call, and folks that he knows and works with, Pastor Bell at Hoover, right, Pastor Bell and Pawpaw, for years, right, have put themselves out there, right, up against resources coming to their nonprofit, right? Judge Humphrey, right, Pastor Humphrey, again, does a great job, prominent public position, uses his voice, has always used his voice from the pulpit on behalf of the people. So to Farah Muhammad, right, again, from other faith traditions, doing the work. And then even newer folks like, Pastor George Parks and Dwight Townsend, they got together and pulled me into 501 Vote, a new expression of their desire, right, to use the pulpit, again, up against probably political pressure to do things for the people. But I just wanted to pull what you were saying into this geography, but also up into folks that are doing stuff right now.
If you don't mind me riffing off of that, because, I think I'm glad you pointed that out, Reverend Freeman, that the relative privilege that, I think sometimes church folks, especially folks in leadership in churches, enjoy because of the certain level of institutional independence that churches have. And that, especially in the Bible Belt, where we all are kind of an outmoded, sometimes illegal, tax status threatening privilege that churches tend to take on some social issues. And, I think what am I asking here? So, there is the racial element, right? Whereas we see, churches can generally agree on some elements of doctrine, generally speaking. Churches can generally agree that we're going to all have a food kitchen and we're going to feed people. That's across race and across denomination. Churches generally agree that it's good to go down to the camps where our homeless siblings are and to feed them. Churches generally agree on that. Unfortunately, where churches tend to split, tend to part ways, is when we start, using oddly radical terms these days, like economic equity. And when we start talking about race in general, folks like to have a good kind of surface level conversation about race, but most of it is a rush toward the hugging type of reconciliation. What is the work to be done in our churches to have? Well, let me rephrase it to say that I don't necessarily think that there's anything original we could say about the work to be done, because I think church folks fortunately have been trying to do it. So we have some models to look at. And so I want to ask the entire panel, what is the work to be done to breach some of these harder and very politicized subjects that, I feel, you might feel that the church should have some unity on? Stuff like the death penalty, stuff like economic inequality, stuff like racial injustice, and really naming those things very explicitly. I'm sorry, I'm being a bad teacher. I should pick somebody, but I taught for 8 years. I should know that you got to pick somebody. Reverend Smith, do you mind?
Yeah, I was going to say, for us in the Episcopal Church, we have some really good language already in our prayer book and liturgy in our baptismal covenant about honoring and respecting the dignity of every human person and striving for justice and peace everywhere. So, just always going back to those roots of what it is God is calling us to do in our faith, and rooting ourselves in, God's love, which is, kind of the focal point of this series, of the greatest of these is love, right? And our language for that through our baptismal covenant as being followers and trying to bring beloved community. That's another word we use a lot in the Episcopal Church right now because of our presiding Bishop Michael Curry has brought on this whole curriculum of what it means to build beloved community, and using these words that are already in our tradition, and taking from the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King, you know, using that, bringing that term beloved community to such kind of national acclaim that folks are using it in the churches more. But it's always been a concept that is a very Christian idea, right? Christ was, you know, building what we would now call beloved community among his followers, among the folks most on the margins, right? And so I think just in my perspective, in my church and in Oklahoma, you know, talking about these issues from, you know, the center of our faith and things that Jesus would care about, and now in our time and day, you know what I mean? Like, who were the, you know, the outcast folks in his time? Who are they right now? And how do we, you know, engage in relationship with them now, using those ideals and our theology of what that is? And I think for us, starting with our baptismal covenant, is this is an ethical and moral imperative to engage with these questions in communities, and bringing God's kingdom on earth, and framing it in that light, I think makes it easier to access maybe, you know, the buzzwords like, you know, economic injustice or whatever it is, but doing it in more of Christian language, I think, at least for white communities, which I'm mostly a part of, it's a little easier to enter in that way, if that makes sense.
Reverend Freeman, I saw you preparing.
Yeah, Reverend Davis, thank you. That's a beautiful question that you raised, and thank you, Reverend Smith, for what you raised there. You know, Reverend Davis, I think you talked about reconciliation and something more than kind of let's just give a hug kind of reconciliation, and the ways in which in faith spaces I've heard that term sort of tossed about is problematic for me. Because my first question is reconcile to what? If we kind of look at the etymology of the word reconcile, we're talking about sort of going to something, back to something, right? And so for me, the repair component, right, is just so present when we're talking about reconciling. If we're talking about kind of the racial divide, as it were, around churches, you know, and the kind of famous line that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, maybe it's 9:30 now, whatever it is, it's the most segregated hour. The rest of that conversation, though, is that there's good reason for that. And then we have to ask the question, for me, in my context, and to Black folk, is integration in that way even desirable, right? There's a reason that that space is there and that we hold that space in the way that that space is held. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't be in space together, but my, you know, as a pastor, as a former pastor, you know, my sort of framing around that was that, yeah, we can be in that place. And to my white brothers and sisters, the question is more, can you kind of handle my testimony, right? Because it's, you know, this is, you know, it's going to be a prophetic kind of arc to all of this. And so I think that there is some deep work to be done in white spaces and in Black and brown spaces to sort of build, first for white brothers and sisters to build muscle for it, and for Black and brown brothers and sisters to believe themselves, right, and affirm one another. And then, you know, talk about what repair and reconciliation. And lastly, I'll say, I think we got to bend to the wisdom of those who've been made most vulnerable by structural racism and structural oppression. And that's Black and brown and indigenous folks. Like we got to bend to that wisdom. And I think it is important for white brothers and sisters to begin to deal with the idea when we're talking about that vision, and Reverend Smith said it well, the beloved community, like, everybody knows something, but who knows best? Like, where are we getting that? Where are we kind of getting that wisdom from? And then let's work with that, right? So.
Reverend Chavarria, to that same question, you have, all of us do, but you have this particular unique perspective as a pastor in a cooperative parish between two churches that serve Black and brown parishioners. What I'm gonna say, what is that like? It's kind of a too wide open a question, but I've always kind of wondered at the next of that, and in doing that, is there the same element of kind of bridging bridging the 11 o'clock divide? Is that an element of what the Southwest Cooperative Parish does? Is this a coalition building process, between, which I think is sorely missing between Black and brown communities here in Central Arkansas? How does that?
I think for this is like we can memorize the Bible, but still here in this very biblical state, a lot of people don't act like that. And that is discriminations in kindergarten, discrimination in elementary, more discrimination in middle school that cut the wings of our kids. Even discrimination between the students and discrimination for the teachers. And that is like everybody speak about the Bible and everybody speak, I went to the church 3 times a week, and no, I'm going because I went 5 times a week. Yeah, and why you learn and all these hours in the church, because look like a lot of people don't act like that. Jesus was and is right now in our heart a revolutionary person, not a weak person that act like everybody else, to don't be in bad situations or things like that. No. That's why some people don't like him. Because he speaks the truth, even whether the people like it or not. He points the bad things that the people are doing. And we need to be just a little bit like that.
We need that honesty.
Say
Absolutely.
something is bad, recognize when something is bad, and the churches do not lose the time of the people. Educate them. Memorize the Bible. Don't save anybody. Save our soul, yes. But in the middle time, our kids and grandkids will live in poverty and misery and in no education. That's my point.
And Reverend Chavarria, if I can follow up and ask this, because for some folks, faith and advocacy go hand in hand. I imagine that all the folks on this Zoom meeting right now, that there's no separation between the two. But for others, they feel like politics, if you will, or advocacy or protest even should be left to the other folks, and that we're here for. Those are temporal concerns. So how do you reconcile your faith? How would you direct on it in your ministry? How would you direct folks to reconcile, using that word again, Reverend Freeman, your faith identity with your advocacy work? Reverend Chavarria.
Well, I think my balance is more in advocate and education. Yeah, and maybe I am not good preacher or reverend, because and this I have 3 years, yes. And during all my life, I advocate for the poor people, or for the people who they need certain education at certain point and they don't have it. So
Well, I would extend that. I would
that's my bishop. Don't say that.
Well, you know, I just say that, you know, the bishops aren't on the ground like we are. You know, we're the foot soldiers, so we know better, Reverend Chavarria. I'll extend that. I would like to extend that question to all of the panel. Again, just, you know, in an environment where, and it's weird because it's usually the folks who are very politically involved in you know, what they call social issues, who feel like that the advocacy, the protest of other folks is kind of counter to their religious duty. So how do you and Reverend Freeman, I'm trying to use something other than reconcile, but for lack of a better word, at this very moment, how do you reconcile? How do you, you know, kind of connect your faith to your advocacy work? Reverend Freeman, Reverend Smith, feel free to jump in, anybody. You all are so polite.
So real quick, I told you I really do want to hear the folks. I'm sort of like Reverend Chavarria, right? Like this ministry thing, right? This last, I don't know, 12 or 13 years of 30 years of adulthood, right? And I'm older than 30, so 30 years of full adulthood, right? And so honestly, I think the ministry part of it, follow on the advocacy piece of it. Like I've been an advocate and a community person, much longer than I've been a faith leader. And I think that those experiences have shaped and added to how I see myself as a faith leader. But honestly, those are primary for me.
I was going to chime in and talk about, I think the way I connect my activism with my faith is, I've always believed like faith without works is dead. And I really don't understand what we're doing if not navel gazing, if we're not helping, our brother and sister in Christ. And that is my deep understanding of Trinitarian theology, and God's character is relational. And it wasn't Audre Lorde who said, I'm not free till we're all free, or, my justice is wrapped up in your justice. You know what I mean? Like we're all connected. And the Christian tradition is certainly not the only tradition to think in this way. Our indigenous brothers and sisters have always had a deeper understanding of our connection to the earth and creation, and how we care for our planet and the animals and the waters. And so it is too with my brothers and sisters of different colors and different cultures. We are all connected, and the way I live my life impacts other folks. It does. And that it's inextricably has to do with my faith. I cannot separate the two. My salvation's wrapped up in yours. And I cannot be, to me, I cannot be a follower of Jesus and not understand our connectivity any more than I can't, disassemble the Trinitarian, understanding of God as Father, Son, Holy Spirit. I don't want to undo those things. Those things are meant to be together for a reason, just like we are together on this earth for this reason, trying to learn how to love one another and use the powers that we have or don't have to care for each other in this great American experiment, right? But I could get preaching, but I'm gonna chill.
Yeah, that's good stuff, Reverend Smith. And thank you all for that. Reverend Davis, for me, I don't know how to practice my faith without being activist. Jeremiah Wright helped me some time ago when he just talked about, this text that we have, that we hold sacred and dear, comes to us under 6 eras of oppression, right? Uh, and so I like knew that, but when he said it out loud, I was like, right. And so I began to think about this. And for me, when we talk about kind of faith, certainly what's been central in my experience as a Black Christian, Protestant, has been the kind of centeredness of the Bible, the biblical text, and then of course there are a lot of other things in terms of tradition and so on and so forth. But as I look at that text, for me, an honest reading for me is that there's certainly spiritual memoir in that story, and it is a great big geopolitical story as well, right? From the very mentioning of the promised land, right? The promised land, like what is that about? And sort of coming all the way through. So it is a geopolitical story of a particular community at a particular time, kind of bearing witness and also struggling with it interculturally as well, right? In other words, replicating some of the things that we see in kind of the ancient imperial models and forces, right? Replicating those in their own community. So for me, at the crux of it, Reverend Davis, is a question about how is power operating, and it always is. And so if I'm a Jesus follower, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, lifting from Isaiah, which was scholars believe is a Jubilee text, right? Then that tethers me, to a practice of faith that is about justice and in all of its forms and activism and so on and so forth. So I just, and I don't want to, but I wouldn't be able to figure out how to separate those things. Like the fact that Jesus is a thing as he comes into the world has politics all over it.
Yes.
Right. And so that's kind of, I can't get away from it. That's what I'm saying. If I'm true to Reverend Smith's point of following Jesus.
And Reverend Freeman, when you're talking about the biblical text, and I think about the fact that excuse my characterization if I'm wrong, but it just seems like in America, we have a very individualistic view of since we are Christians in here, I'll say of God, and a lot of how we concentrate our energy centers around those individual blessings, and these days I think they call it favor. That we can get, and therefore much of our economic policies can be traced back to that ideology. So how to all the panelists does one who is dedicated to the work of justice make sense of the scripture, this particular scripture where Jesus says, "The poor shall always be with you"? How does that interpretation of the biblical text contribute to or oppose this charitable / feed the poor mindset versus the eradicate poverty mindset? Reverend Anderson?
Well, what I try to do, I don't want to try to exegete it right this moment, but I think when you think about, again, what Reverend Freeman was saying about sort of the geopolitical context that Jesus worked in, that's duplicated today, right? Like there's not that wide of a difference between the context that he was working in, relative to Rome and control over that part of the land, and the wealth gap that existed between people that had and then 99% of the people that had nothing, right? So there's that, we're still pretty much in the same boat when you can take 10 people on earth, and they have as much wealth as, as 80% of the other people on earth, right? So there's not that much difference. My sense of what he meant was, from a purely theological perspective, the folks in power are always going to try to keep power. The people that have wealth are always going to try to hold on to that wealth. And in that sense, maybe, and now I'm saying maybe because I hadn't done exegesis, right? If I was preaching, I wouldn't say maybe, but maybe in this context, maybe it was more of a prophetic of it. The poor will always be with us unless, right?
Or because
we begin to believe, right? We begin to believe what it is he's trying to help us understand. Now, again, in the context that we live in today, you're absolutely right. People use that scripture to say, well, there's nothing I can do, right? I can do, what I call, hospice care for the poor, right? I can try to ameliorate the impact of poverty on people by, making sure we've got a food pantry, making sure I can give them clothes. I can ameliorate the impacts, but it's not my job to have us not have poor people, right? And this is the intersection of what we're talking about, and honestly, WRF's vision of equity, right? Like in our Equity 2025, the text that we're operating off of from the foundation's perspective, what we're saying is you have to dismantle systems that don't produce equitable outcomes. When we talk about economic equity, we say everybody should live in a thriving community, make a living wage, and be able to build wealth. Everybody. We get to that outcome eventuality, then the poor would not be with us, right? So yeah, I mean, I know how it's used today, but I think in terms of, what Reverend Sterling said about the Bible as a text itself, I think we've got the responsibility to interpret it in a way that lifts up everything that Jesus said and not just that one thing.
You helped me out here, Reverend Anderson, because I think, where that scripture where Jesus is, and people interpret it where Jesus calls that woman a dog, and then the scripture where Jesus says the poor will always be with us, is something that I struggle with. And so I wonder, Reverend Smith, Bishop mandating and God willing, Reverend Sarah Smith, if, how do you preach that? How do you preach that, in a world where folks take it to mean that, well, it's not something that we can ultimately do about feeding folks and getting folks out of poverty?
That's a hard one. That's a hard one because
I just have to ask it. I get the easy part of just asking it.
Yeah, you don't shy away from these pointed questions, Reverend Davis. God, I was all prepared to answer my, the Episcopal Church's, ridiculousness and our racist, structures of hierarchy. But
well, so I think though, Reverend Smith, there's space for that, and I'm sorry because
no, I love where this is going.
But I think too that we maybe come to that same conclusion about stuff like race. We see those as intractable issues. Right. And so we say, we'll just work along the margins and not do something about it. So absolutely right to expand that question, because, we're not just talking about, folks who live in abject poverty. We're talking about folks living under abject white supremacy. We're talking about folks living under abject misogyny and how churches practice that. So, please do expand that question, and certainly, when you were talking earlier, I thought about, actually, Reverend Freeman mentioned her about Pauli Murray and, the beacon that she was for women entering the ministry. Mm-hmm. And yet there is this history in the Episcopal Church. So, how do we get beyond this idea that these are intractable things, within the context of the Episcopal Church's history and your experiences? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have such an interesting history, and I think it's very telling, in places like Oklahoma, when we do better with Latino ministry than we do with Black ministry. and just where we're really comfortable with, you know, and to a great history, a rich history of, you know, civil rights leaders and folks, you know, leading movements in the Episcopal Church, like Polly Murray. She's such a great example. She was the first African-American woman to be ordained in the Episcopal Church in the 70s. And that's when women were first ordained to the Episcopal Church in the 70s. But yeah, to get folks excited or even interested in talking about systems is really, really hard. And it seems insurmountable when you're just trying to kind of survive and raise your kids and whatever. But I think just building awareness of how we are complicit in those systems kind of starts shaking off the dust from our eyes a little bit, and how we can begin conversations and you know, my white communities, and just, I think just even the project of these questions and making me go back into my history and learn about our hierarchical tradition and everything that has been made by white supremacy in my tradition, and keeps holding us kind of, you know, this kind of heavy hand that you don't even see, but we're also wrapped up in it. It feels really, really hard to get around when I've got, you know, I use a prayer book every day that was created and written by white men, right? And it's just not as life-giving to me as, say, reading some Celtic spirituality or the, you know, mothers of the church. So I don't know if I'm answering the question at all, but saying, you know, these things they're so pervasive and so heavy that they really cloud our ability to even think we can do anything, I think.
You know, Reverend Davis, I wanted to kind of circle back to that question about the poor will be with you always as well. And so much appreciate Reverend Anderson complicating that as he talked about it. And he was exegeting, by the way, as he talked through it. But you know, as I lean into this text, my question is it a text about poverty at all? Jesus didn't bring up the poor. The disciples, or depending on which account you read, in Matthew, Mark, or Judas in John, right? So there's some context around this text that really, I think, adds some layers to it, because the John text says that Judas asked the question or interrogated the sister, but parenthetically it says, well, he didn't care about the poor anyway because he was a thief, right? So I think that I'm questioning whether this text is actually about the poor and poverty at all. I think the poor and poverty get lifted up. The poor get lifted up as an object lesson. I think the text is about this deed that this sister is doing, who probably was poor, who it says broke open her alabaster, container and anointed Jesus, right? And this his preparation for going where he was going ultimately. So what it made me think about is that there was a lesson here that Jesus was getting across, that Martin King sort of more than a millennia later invokes when he says it's always right to do right. So for me, it's kind of like you actually need to be observing what this sister is doing, this right and righteous act that she's performing. And if you do that, then you will serve those who are poor, and hopefully Reverend Anderson change the conditions so that you won't have the poor with you always, right? The poor are going to be with you always if you continue to think like you're thinking right now. So I don't think, I'm not sure that the text itself is actually about poverty at all. I don't think that's the centering thing. I think it is about this kind of righteous and right act, the timing of which was very important for this sister to do this because of where Jesus was headed. And so I think that is kind of the center of it. And if we turn that object lesson to what it means to be a disciple, then the lesson for me is that you would be doing things such that the conditions would be such that, Reverend Anderson, as he said, that there would not be poor. There would be enoughism. Everybody would have what they need. So I think this sort of turning this into an inevitable charity text, I think can be sort of exegetically and hermeneutically irresponsible, right? I think we got to push a little bit more on what was going on. And I'm not so sure that that text is about the poor at all.
You further complicated the text. I'm grateful for that. So grateful for that. I told the last panel that if you catch me taking notes and you happen to hear it in a sermon, I'm gonna give credit. I might not remember. I'll say I've heard it said, and a person once said, I'll say that, and just know that if you remember that you said it, that I got it from you, and I appreciate you in advance for that. This is wow. And so it looks like we've rounded a corner. It's been a very, very good conversation today. And wanna ask that, particularly for the sake of this fellowship, because this is meant to be instructive, mostly instructive, also just kind of engaging. And so I thank you for the engagement. I thank you for the instruction. I thank you for the power of your witness in this panel and in your life. Which is why you were chosen to be on this panel. Thank you to Reverend Hinton Hill for that. So in this last, your last statement, this panel, these series of conversations we call the greatest of these, and you know where that comes from. In our sacred text, the text that we share in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, it says, love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. I like that a lot. It rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And then it says, finally at verse 13, and now faith, hope, and love abide. These three, and the greatest of these is love. And as we mentioned earlier, sometimes love can be a very empty notion for church folks. It manifests itself in specific events, and then it goes into some latency. How do we continue to practice love? How do we continue a practice of love? And I would even add further, what does love have to do with it? What is the role of faithful people in change and in social movements in the South? And what does love have to do with it? To quote that famous psalmist, Tina Turner. And I'll begin with Reverend Chavarria, who, again, I'm grateful was able to join us today. How does love figure into change in the South, in our churches, in our communities?
Well, for me, it's just to be open my eyes and open my heart and really notice what the people need. Because sometimes I can think the people need one thing and it's very different. And it is like more aware and more sensitive about the situation of the people.
Thank you, Reverend Chavarria.
Thank you.
Reverend Cory Anderson.
Love's a verb, right? It's a thing that we do. I'd add, other text to it. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. The work that we're trying to do, I think, at WRF is about, particularly with this, is about helping people to begin to understand that other people also belong to them. So if you love your neighbor as you love yourself, like, what would you do for yourself? What opportunities would you open up for yourself? What would you not stand for yourself or for your own children? And we ought to be loving others enough to want to open up opportunities, to not stand for marginalization, to want everybody to have the same outcomes that we have. So I would put those two things together. Love is an action. It's about belonging. If we love others as we love ourselves, there are just some things that we would not stand for. And if we wouldn't stand for them, then things would be different.
Yes, indeed. Sarah Smith, our neighbor to the west. Talk to us.
Yes.
What does love have to do with it? As we look to exemplify the greatest of these truths, what should love look like in a faith-rooted movement today?
Mm-hmm. Well, like our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, always says, you know, if it's not about love, it's not about God. And like I said earlier, God's loving, liberating, and life-giving character, it's relational. And if we can't have relationship as the starting point to these things, and two, I always say, you know, encountering the other with a posture of curiosity. And that, I think, is the true entrance into, you know, building relationships. And that is how love works. That's that animating life force that brings us together, is God's love and action in the world. It's a verb, like Reverend Anderson said. And to me, that piece, and the way I would say it, you know, is it's relational. Everything, it has to be relational. It has to do, I was going to bring up, you know, we didn't get to talk much about, you know, it's going to be the centennial of the 1921 Tulsa race massacre here in Oklahoma. And our diocese has partnered with the good folks up at Vernon AME Church in Tulsa. And we don't have a big, you know, Catholic Charities or, you know, big kind of fundraising arm of the Episcopal Diocese of Oklahoma, but we've, in our own way, you know, created ways to, you know, build funds and contribute to some projects that Vernon is passionate about. And we went and met with them and said, hey, how can we assist you in building up what you're doing here in Tulsa, and be a part of, you know, commemorating this time and bringing this time to awareness and to our majority white, you know, churches here in Oklahoma. And we've done a series of resources and liturgy and prayer that our churches can use during this month of May, of when we're commemorating on the race massacre. I think it's Memorial Day, the 31st of May, is when we're going to do a prayer wall dedication at Vernon AME. And our bishop's going to be there with Reverend Dr. Turner, who's the, you know, head pastor at Vernon AME. And we've helped raise $165,000 to help renovate their kitchen. They've been doing a food ministry the entire pandemic, every single day. And they've been on the forefront of the pandemic, helping the brothers and sisters in need, and in the Greenwood district area. Anyways, it's just, for us in the Episcopal Church in Oklahoma, it's coming alongside of, and like you've all been saying, like letting the voice of the oppressed lead the way and tell us how we can be supportive and how we can come alongside, I think, is building that relational love, with us not being the center, because that's not what it's about. It's about being in a relationship and like you've all said, positioning the voice of the oppressed as the one we want to learn from and walk with. So,
Reverend Freeman.
Yeah, thank you, Reverend Davis and Reverend Chavarria, and Reverend Anderson, and God willing, and the bishop blessing Reverend Smith. It's just a privilege to be with you all. I'm learning so much, and I don't want it to end, actually. Love, I've been thinking about this, and I don't have the words, but I think love in faith movements, before it can be a love that takes in and embraces, it has to be a love that removes barriers and lets go of stuff. And I just think that for me, it means doctrineless space, from the standpoint of kind of dogmatic space. It means doctrineless. It means, you know, true free space, the gracious making of space. And so that in these movements, everybody can show up as they are and not have to worry about being in an action or in a movement that, 80% of the way it's good, and then that thing happens to show that person how they're other, right? And then it becomes not, a justice space. So don't really have the words, Reverend Davis, but it's something about letting go and removing barriers in order to take in and embrace. It's kind of what I'm thinking about, how this love has to manifest itself.
Thank you. Well, siblings, this has been for me a master class in thoughtfulness, and I appreciate, despite the contortions of these submitted questions, how thoughtful you all have been, and I'm really grateful. One of my favorite poets says that love is like Winnie the Pooh doing voodoo in corrective shoes. And he talks about his confusion about humans' expression of love, humans' verbal expression of love, and its disconnection to what they actually do. So, I'm encouraged today because I know there's some folks out there on the battlefield really doing love the right way. But though, I would love to ask our host, I'm just the moderator, I'm just here to ask the questions and soak it up and take notes. I'd ask our esteemed host, Reverend Chantel Hinton Hill, if she could also weigh in on this. Chantel Hinton Hill, close us up. Let us know what's love got to do with it.
Hi, thank you, Rev, for punting that so nicely to me to close us out. One thing that I will never forget from the very first theologian that I was privileged to meet, which is my grandmother, who is now 92 years old, is one of her favorite sayings. She says, "Baby, I wouldn't have a religion I couldn't feel sometimes." And I think that's what love does. The Jesus that I know, the Jesus that loved me and has ushered me into my own salvation, is not only concerned with my soul, but is concerned with loving my flesh, right? And so I feel that justice and the work of justice absolutely is the love that you can feel sometimes. It's the love that will help you let go, in Reverend Freeman's language. It's the love that disrupts and is even willing to destroy some things, in order to bring in something new and birth something new. And so I just feel like love, as it relates to faith movements and social movements, is at the core of it, but it's not a kumbaya love. It's a chaotic love, which is what we heard from Reverend Dr. Smallwood today. It's a love that's willing to create, but also destroy the things that impede it from forward progress. And so that is the word that I would leave you all with today. I am so pleased and so blessed by your ministries, by your gifts, and by who you are as people. We are excited to have you be a part of these conversations as we get ready to prepare and launch our Micah Fellows program. If you want more information about that program, please go to micahfellowsprogram.org. We'll put that link up on the screen for you to find out more about the program. And we just really appreciate you all for being here. Thank you all. God bless. Amen and Ashe.